November 1966. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, a city of over 2 million people, the political and economic heart of a country that was fighting for its survival. If you stood on the terrace of the majestic hotel overlooking the Saigon River in late '66, you'd see a city that looked almost normal, a city where people went about their business, where restaurants served French cuisine, where bars and nightclubs catered to American servicemen, where cyclos and motorcycles and cars clogged the streets in chaotic traffic that somehow flowed despite the apparent lack of traffic rules. But if you looked closer, if you paid attention to details, you'd see the sandbags stacked around government buildings, the armed guards at checkpoints, the concertina wire protecting military installations, the occasional crater from a terrorist bombing, the nervous glances that civilians gave to parked vehicles that might contain explosives. Saigon in late '66 was a city. Under siege, not from conventional military forces that you could see approaching, but from an invisible enemy that lived among the population, that looked like civilians during the day and became fighters at night, that could strike anywhere at any time with bombs or rockets or assassination squads. The strategic importance of Saigon to the war in Vietnam cannot be overstated. This wasn't just another city, another piece of territory that might change hands without fundamentally affecting the outcome of the war. Saigon was the capital of South Vietnam, the seat of government, the location where President Nguyen Van Thieu and Vice President Nguyen Sao Ky ran what passed for a functioning administration. It was the headquarters for MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, where General William Westmoreland coordinated American military operations throughout the country. It was the major port where supplies arrived from the United States, the logistical hub that fed American and South Vietnamese military operations throughout the Third and the Fourth Corps. Saigon was also a psychological prize of immense value. The city represented the legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government, proof that Saigon controlled at least its own capital, even if large portions of the countryside were contested or controlled by the Viet Cong. If Saigon fell, if the Viet Cong managed to seize control of the capital, or to demonstrate that the government couldn't protect even its own seat of power, the psychological impact would be devastating, both in South Vietnam and in the United States, where public support for the war was already beginning to erode. The territory immediately surrounding Saigon was designated Gia Dinh Province, a region that encompassed the districts of Binh Chanh, Nha Bay, Thu Duc, Hoc Mon, and Cu Chi, agricultural areas and small towns that ringed the capital and that provided food and workers for the city. Gia Dinh Province was strategically critical because it was the buffer zone between Saigon and the areas further out, where the Viet Cong operated more or less freely. If the enemy controlled Gia Dinh, they could isolate Saigon, could cut the roads leading into the city, could launch attacks on the capital itself from bases just miles away. By late '66, Gia Dinh Province had become a major problem, a security situation that was deteriorating rapidly, and that threatened to undermine everything the United States and South Vietnam were trying to accomplish. The Viet Cong had become increasingly bold in their operations around Saigon, attacking police stations, ambushing military patrols, assassinating government officials, cutting roads, conducting terrorist bombings in the city itself. The South Vietnamese government's control over Gia Dinh Province was slipping, and with it, control over the approaches to Saigon. To understand what was happening in Gia Dinh Province in '66, you need to understand who the enemy was and what they were trying to accomplish. The Viet Cong forces operating around Saigon weren't just random guerrillas, weren't just local farmers who picked up weapons at night. These were organized military units, trained and equipped, and led by experienced commanders who had specific strategic objectives. U.S. intelligence in October of '66 estimated that the Viet Cong in Gia Dinh Province fielded 8 battalions, each battalion containing between 200 and 300 fighters, organized collectively as the 165A Regiment. This unit was called the Capital Liberation Regiment, a name that made their mission absolutely clear. They weren't there to control rice paddies or to tax farmers. They were there to threaten and ultimately to seize Saigon itself. The 165A Regiment had been formed in 1965 as part of a larger communist plan to attack the capital, a plan that had been called Plan A. but that had never been implemented because the massive influx of American combat troops in the summer of '65 had stabilized the South Vietnamese government and forced the communists onto the defensive. But the 165A Regiment hadn't been disbanded, hadn't disappeared. Instead, it had been positioned in the districts around Saigon, in Hoc Mon and Go Vap and the other areas of Gia Dinh Province, waiting for another opportunity to strike at the heart of the South Vietnamese state. These weren't poorly equipped guerrillas armed with homemade weapons. The 165A Regiment's battalions had AK-47 assault rifles, machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, recoilless rifles, all the weapons of a conventional infantry unit. They had radios for communication, medical supplies, ammunition, stockpiles hidden in caches throughout their operational areas. They were supplied through routes that came from Cambodia, weapons and ammunition that arrived at the port of Sihanoukville and were trucked along what became known as the Sihanouk Trail to Viet Cong, bases near the border. The tactics the 165A Regiment used around Saigon combined conventional military operations with terrorism and guerrilla warfare. They'd attack South Vietnamese military outposts and police stations, overwhelming small garrisons with superior numbers, seizing weapons and supplies, then melting away before reinforcements could arrive. They'd ambush military convoys on the roads leading into Saigon, using command-detonated mines and automatic weapons fire to destroy vehicles and kill soldiers. They'd cut roads by blowing craters in the pavement or by felling trees, isolating districts from one another and from the capital. The terrorism was systematic and calculated. Viet Cong squads had monthly assassination quotas, specific numbers of government officials and supporters they were required to kill. Village chiefs and district officials were primary targets because killing them demonstrated that the government couldn't protect its own representatives, that working for the Saigon government was a death sentence. But the targets also included teachers and medical personnel, and anyone else who was seen as supporting the government or opposing the Viet Cong. In Binh Chanh District, one of the districts in Gia Dinh Province, the situation by October '66 had become critical. The Viet Cong had overrun a police station, had killed or captured the policemen stationed there, had seized their weapons. They were repeatedly cutting the roads in the area, making it impossible for government forces to move freely or for supplies to reach military posts. The district was effectively under Viet Cong control, with government authority limited to a few fortified positions that could be reinforced by helicopter, but that couldn't project power into the surrounding countryside. The pattern was similar in other districts around Saigon. In Thu Duc, in Ha Bay, in Hoc Mon, the Viet Cong were becoming bolder, conducting operations that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. They were attacking closer to Saigon itself, launching rocket and mortar attacks on military installations on the outskirts of the city, conducting terrorist bombings in Saigon proper, demonstrating that nowhere was truly safe. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that the Viet Cong infrastructure in Gia Dinh Province wasn't just military. There was an extensive political organization, secret operatives who lived in villages and towns, who appeared to be ordinary civilians, but who collected intelligence and recruited new members and organized the population. This political infrastructure was what made the Viet Cong resilient, what allowed them to continue operations even after military defeats, because they could recruit new fighters and could gather intelligence on government operations and could maintain popular support, or at least popular acquiescence through a combination of propaganda and intimidation. The South Vietnamese forces responsible for security in Gia Dinh Province weren't particularly effective at countering this threat. The ARVN units in the area were spread thin, responsible for large territories with insufficient numbers of troops. The regional force and popular force militias, the local defense units, were poorly trained and poorly equipped, and often didn't want to fight. The national police were focused on law enforcement in the cities and didn't have the capability to conduct counterinsurgency operations in rural areas. General William Westmoreland, the commander of MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, understood that the security situation around Saigon was becoming untenable. Westmoreland's overall strategy in Vietnam was based on attrition, on finding and fixing enemy forces and destroying them with American firepower, on conducting search and destroy operations that would kill Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers faster than they could be replaced, on reaching what he called the crossover point, where enemy losses would exceed their ability to sustain the war. This strategy had some logic to it in the remote areas of Vietnam, in the Central Highlands and along the DMZ, and in War Zone C and War Zone D, where the enemy operated in large units and where American mobility and firepower gave significant advantages. But around Saigon, the strategy couldn't work, because the enemy wasn't operating in large units that could be found and destroyed. Instead, they were operating in small groups, in squad-size and platoon-size elements that would conduct attacks and then disappear into the population. The pacification programs that were supposed to extend government control into contested areas weren't working either. These programs were based on the theory that if you could provide security to the population, if you could give villagers confidence that the government could protect them from Viet Cong retaliation, then they'd support the government and provide intelligence on enemy activities and deny the Viet Cong the popular support they needed to continue operations. But you couldn't provide security without troops, and the troops weren't there in sufficient numbers in Gia Dinh Province. Westmoreland also faced a political problem. The South Vietnamese government under President Thieu and Vice President Khai was sensitive about sovereignty, about maintaining the appearance that South Vietnam was defending itself with American assistance rather than being defended by Americans, while the South Vietnamese stood aside. Having American troops responsible for security around the capital was embarrassing to the South Vietnamese government, was an admission that they couldn't protect their own capital without direct American military intervention. But by November of '66, the situation had deteriorated to the point where something had to be done, where the choice was between American military intervention in Gia Dinh Province or accepting that the security situation around Saigon would continue to worsen until it became critical. Westmoreland made the decision to propose a joint operation, American and South Vietnamese forces working together to improve security in the districts around Saigon, to reduce the Viet Cong threat, to re-establish government control. The concept Westmoreland proposed to General Sao Van Vien, the chief of the Joint General Staff of the South Vietnamese military, was straightforward in theory, though it would prove complicated in execution. American battalions would be paired with ARVN battalions, working together in the districts of Gia Dinh Province to conduct security operations. The paired units would establish bases, conduct patrols, set up ambushes, search villages for Viet Cong, interdict supply routes, gradually reducing enemy capability and extending government control. The operation would focus initially on 3 districts, Binh Chon, Nha Bay, and Thu Duc, the areas where the security situation was most critical. American forces would come from Squai Field Force Vietnam, the command responsible for American operations in the 3 Corps, the military region that included Saigon and the surrounding provinces. Specifically, 1 battalion from the 1st Infantry Division and 2 battalions from the 25th Infantry Division would be assigned to the operation. The ARVN units would come from the 3 Corps forces. The expectation, at least Westmoreland's initial expectation, was that this would be a temporary measure, that by February of '67, the South Vietnamese forces would be able to take over full responsibility for security in Gia Dinh Province, and American units could be deployed elsewhere, could go back to conducting search and destroy operations in the remote areas where Westmoreland believed the war would be won. This expectation would prove to be wildly optimistic, would demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the war being fought around Saigon. Operation Fairfax officially commenced in December of 1966, though different sources give slightly different start dates ranging from late November to early December, probably reflecting that units were deploying and beginning operations at different times rather than all starting on a single date. The operation was also known by its Vietnamese name, Operation Rang Dong, Dawn in English, a name that suggested new beginnings and hope for improved security. The American battalions assigned to Operation Fairfax moved into their operational areas and established bases, fortified positions from which they could conduct patrols and from which they could respond to enemy activity. The concept of operations called for the paired American and ARVN battalions to work together, sharing intelligence, conducting combined operations, gradually learning from each other, and building the ARVN's capability to operate independently. The tactical approach combined several elements. Units would establish checkpoints on roads, stopping and searching vehicles and civilians, looking for weapons or supplies being transported to Viet Cong forces. They'd conduct cordon and search operations in villages suspected of harboring enemy fighters or supplies, surrounding a village and then systematically searching every structure and questioning every inhabitant. They'd set up ambushes along trails and canals that intelligence indicated were being used by the Viet Cong for movement. They'd conduct patrols, both mounted patrols in vehicles and dismounted patrols on foot, maintaining presence throughout the operational area. The immediate results were encouraging. By the end of December, just a few weeks after the operation began, American and South Vietnamese forces had killed or captured 235 Viet Cong, a dramatic increase from the 15 killed or captured in November before the operation started. This suggested that the increased American presence and the more aggressive operations were having an effect, were disrupting Viet Cong activities in Gia Dinh Province. But there were also concerning signs that the operation wasn't achieving everything its planners had hoped. Despite what appeared to be general improvement in security, ambushes actually increased during this initial period. The Viet Cong were responding to the increased American and South Vietnamese military presence not by retreating or by reducing their operations, but by attacking more frequently, by conducting more ambushes of military patrols and convoys. This suggested that the 165A Regiment wasn't being destroyed or driven out of Gia Dinh Province, but was adapting its tactics to the new situation. The relationship between American and ARVN forces in the operation was complicated from the beginning. The concept of paired battalions working together made sense on paper, but proved difficult in practice. The American and South Vietnamese forces had different training, different equipment, different tactical approaches, different levels of motivation and aggressiveness. American commanders often found that their ARVN counterparts were reluctant to conduct night operations, preferred to remain in defensive positions rather than conducting aggressive patrols, weren't willing to take the risks that Americans considered necessary to find and engage the enemy. Language barriers made coordination difficult. Few American officers spoke Vietnamese. Few Vietnamese officers spoke English fluently enough for detailed tactical discussions. Operations that required close coordination, like cordon and search missions where timing was critical, were hard to execute when the units involved couldn't communicate effectively. Misunderstandings led to failures, opportunities lost, because units weren't in position at the right time, or because intelligence wasn't shared properly. There were also deeper issues about the nature of the South Vietnamese military and the level of corruption and inefficiency that plagued it. ARVN units often had ghost soldiers on their rolls, troops who didn't actually exist, but whose pay was collected by officers. Supplies that were supposed to go to combat units were diverted and sold on the black market. Officers who were competent and honest were sometimes transferred out, while officers with political connections but limited military ability were given command positions. In January of 1967, General Westmoreland made a significant change to Operation Fairfax, a change that reflected both the operation's importance and the realization that it was going to require more sustained effort than initially anticipated. He ordered that the 199th Infantry Brigade, a light infantry brigade that had arrived in Vietnam in December of '66, take over as the dedicated unit responsible for the American side of the operation. The 199th Infantry Brigade, nicknamed the Red Catchers, was a newly activated unit that had trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, and Camp Shelby, Mississippi, before deploying to Vietnam. The brigade included the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry, the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry, the 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry, and supporting units including artillery, engineers, and cavalry. The brigade was commanded by Brigadier General Charles Ryder, an experienced officer who would be responsible for coordinating the American effort in Operation Fairfax. The 199th established its headquarters at Long Binh Post, a major American base complex northeast of Saigon, and deployed its battalions into the operational areas of Gia Dinh Province. The brigade's mission was clear: work with ARVN forces to improve security in the districts around Saigon, reduce Viet Cong capability to threaten the capital, extend government control over the population and territory. The 199th quickly learned that Operation Fairfax was going to be different from the search and destroy operations that most American units in Vietnam were conducting. This wasn't about finding large enemy units and destroying them in conventional battles. This was about small unit operations, platoons and companies conducting patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations, trying to find an enemy that looked like civilians and that could disappear into the population. This was about presence operations, maintaining security at checkpoints and village outposts, providing protection to civilians who were caught between the government and the Viet Cong. The brigade also quickly encountered the harsh realities of the war being fought around Saigon. In its first month of Operation Fairfax, a company from the 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry was caught in an ambush in Thu Duc District. The company was conducting a routine patrol when Viet Cong forces opened fire from prepared positions, hitting the Americans with automatic weapons fire and rocket-propelled grenades. The ambush was well planned and well executed, the kind of attack that the 165A Regiment had perfected, designed to inflict maximum casualties before the Americans could bring their firepower to bear. Several soldiers were killed, more were wounded, and the company barely fought its way out of the kill zone. This ambush made clear what Operation Fairfax would cost. The Viet Cong weren't going to surrender control of Gia Dinh Province without a fight, weren't going to be intimidated by American firepower or by aggressive operations. They'd fight from ambush positions where they had the advantage. They'd inflict casualties on American and South Vietnamese forces, and they'd use their knowledge of the terrain and their support from the local population to survive despite being outnumbered and outgunned. By February, the intensity of operations was increasing, and so were the results. The number of Viet Cong killed or captured increased to over 300 for the month, suggesting that the 199th's operations were having an effect. Units were conducting more patrols, more ambushes, more cordon and search operations. Intelligence was improving, as informants provided information about Viet Cong locations and activities. The rhythm of the operation was being established, a cycle of patrols and contacts and small firefights that characterized the war being fought for control of the approaches to Saigon. In March of '67, Brigadier General Ryder was promoted and transferred, and command of the 199th Infantry Brigade passed to Brigadier General John F. Freund. Freund had been Westmoreland's assistant and the MACV training director, which meant he had close relationships with General Vian and with General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, the chief of the National Police. These relationships would be important for Operation Fairfax because the operation required close coordination, not just with ARVN military units, but also with the police who were responsible for maintaining order in populated areas and for gathering intelligence on the Viet Cong political infrastructure. Freund took command at a time when the operation appeared to be showing success. Security in the operational areas of Gia Dinh Province seemed to be improving. Ambushes were declining. Viet Cong killed or captured numbers remained high. There was cautious optimism that Operation Fairfax might actually achieve its objectives, that by the end of '67 American units could be withdrawn and security responsibility could be transferred to South Vietnamese forces. But this apparent improvement was regarded by some as illusory, as temporary rather than permanent. The fundamental problem was that while military operations were killing and capturing Viet Cong fighters, they weren't disrupting the political infrastructure that allowed the 165A Regiment to continue operating. The intelligence operations that were supposed to identify and eliminate the political cadre weren't having much success. The Viet Cong's organization among the population remained largely intact, which meant they could continue recruiting new fighters, gathering intelligence, maintaining popular support, or at least acquiescence. There was also the broader problem that the South Vietnamese government wasn't doing its part. Operation Fairfax was supposed to be about more than just military operations. It was supposed to be about pacification, about extending government control and services to the population, about giving people reasons to support the government rather than the Viet Cong. But the government continued to delay reforms, continued to fail at providing basic services, continued to be seen by much of the population as corrupt and ineffective. The result was apathy among the population in Gia Dinh Province. People weren't particularly pro-government, but they weren't particularly pro-Viet Cong either. They were trying to survive, trying to stay out of the war as much as possible, trying not to be caught between the two sides. This apathy made them vulnerable to Viet. Cong political propaganda made them unwilling to provide intelligence to government forces, made the entire pacification effort more difficult. In April and May, the pattern continued. Military operations killed and captured Viet Cong. Security appeared to improve in some areas, but the improvements seemed fragile and temporary. The 199th was learning how to operate in this environment, learning which tactics worked and which didn't, learning where the enemy was strong and where they were weak. But they were also learning that this kind of war, the war for population and territory and political control, was going to take much longer than anyone had anticipated. By June of 1967, 6 months into Operation Fairfax, General Westmoreland was reaching some uncomfortable conclusions about what the operation was revealing, about what it meant for the broader war effort in Vietnam. The conclusions weren't what he'd hoped for when he'd proposed the operation back in November. In fact, they suggested that some of his fundamental assumptions about how to fight the war in Vietnam might be wrong. The first conclusion was that the ARVN and the National Police had become too dependent on American forces to bear the burden of Operation Fairfax. Despite 6 months of working alongside American units, despite training and advice and the example of how Americans conducted operations, the South Vietnamese forces weren't showing the kind of improvement that would allow them to take over full responsibility for security around Saigon. They were still reluctant to conduct aggressive operations, still suffering from leadership and corruption problems, still not performing at the level necessary to defend the capital without American help. This was embarrassing for everyone involved. For General Vien and the South Vietnamese military leadership, it was humiliating that American units had to be responsible for defending Saigon, that the capital of South Vietnam couldn't be protected by South Vietnamese forces alone. For Westmoreland, it meant that the 199th Infantry Brigade was going to be tied down in Gia Dinh Province indefinitely, rather than being available for operations elsewhere. For the pacification program, it suggested that the strategy of building up South Vietnamese forces to take over security wasn't working as planned. In June, Westmoreland advised General Vien that by the end of '67, the 199th Brigade would be withdrawn from Gia Dinh Province. This wasn't because Operation Fairfax had succeeded. It was because Westmoreland needed the 199th for other operations, because he couldn't afford to keep a brigade tied down around Saigon indefinitely when there were North Vietnamese Army units operating in the Central Highlands and along the DMZ that needed to be engaged. Vien agreed with this decision, though he was embarrassed by it. He ordered that the 5th Ranger Group, an ARVN elite unit, take over responsibility for the South Vietnamese side of the operation. The Rangers were supposed to be more capable than regular ARVN units, more aggressive, better trained, better led. If any South Vietnamese force could handle security in Gia Dinh Province, it should be the Rangers. By July, the intensity of Operation Fairfax was increasing, even as plans were being made to eventually wind it down. Over 75 American and ARVN ambushes were being set up each night. Teams positioned along trails and canals and roads waiting for Viet Cong movement. Bases had been established to interdict traffic on the Dong Nai River, cutting one of the major routes the Viet Cong used to move supplies into the operational area. Helicopter gunships were sinking sampans that intelligence indicated were carrying enemy supplies, with an estimated 700 sampans destroyed during the course of the operation. But there was a growing sense among those involved in Operation Fairfax that something was being missed, that despite all the patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations, despite all the Viet Cong killed and captured, the enemy's capability around Saigon wasn't being seriously degraded. The numbers looked good, over 1,200 Viet Cong killed or captured by the time the operation ended in December, but the infrastructure that supported those fighters remained intact. And here's where the story takes a dark turn, where we approach the moment when everything Operation Fairfax had tried to accomplish would be tested and would be found wanting. Because while the 199th Infantry Brigade and their ARVN partners were conducting operations in Gia Dinh Province, while they were patrolling and ambushing and trying to establish security around Saigon, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were planning something that nobody on the American or South Vietnamese side anticipated. Something that would demonstrate just how ineffective Operation Fairfax had actually been. In August, Brigadier General Freund was wounded during an operation, ironically becoming a casualty of the war he was helping to direct, and command of the 189th passed to Brigadier General Robert C. Forbes. Forbes was even more critical of the South Vietnamese performance in Operation Fairfax than his predecessors had been. He regarded the Rangers who were supposed to be taking over as still being too dependent on Americans, still not capable of operating effectively without American support. By September, the pairing of American and ARVN units was officially discontinued. The 189th Brigade and the ARVN Rangers would operate independently in different sectors of Gia Dinh Province, occasionally conducting combined operations, but no longer working together on a daily basis. This change reflected Westmoreland's growing conclusion that the integration of American and ARVN units was counterproductive, that it reduced the ARVN to what amounted to combat auxiliaries, followers rather than independent operators. The ARVN needed to learn to operate on their own, needed to take responsibility for their own operations and their own security. Now we're ready to talk about what Operation Fairfax really was, what it accomplished, what it failed to accomplish, and what it revealed about the war in Vietnam. We've spent nearly 20 minutes discussing the context, the situation in Saigon, the security problems in Gia Dinh Province, the organization and initial operations, because understanding that context is essential to understanding why Operation Fairfax mattered and why its ultimate failure had such profound consequences. Operation Fairfax was officially a joint counterinsurgency and pacification operation conducted by the Mui Field Force Vietnam and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in Gia Dinh Province, lasting from November 1966 to December 15, 1967. 13 months of continuous operations focused on improving security around Saigon and denying the Viet Cong the ability to threaten the capital. But it was also something more than just another operation in a war full of operations with code names and objectives. Operation Fairfax was a test of whether the American strategy in Vietnam could work, whether pacification could succeed, whether the South Vietnamese military could be built up to the point where it could defend its own country. The operational area covered the districts of Binh Chanh, Nha Bay, and Thu Duc, roughly forming a semicircle around the southern and eastern approaches to Saigon. These were agricultural areas dotted with villages and small towns, crisscrossed by canals and rice paddies, terrain that favored defenders and that made it difficult for mechanized forces to operate. The population was rural and poor, rice farmers and fishermen who had lived in these areas for generations, and who had little reason to trust either the government in Saigon or the Viet Cong. The 199th Infantry Brigade, the primary American unit involved, in Operation Fairfax after January 67, operated from bases established throughout the operational area. The brigade's 3 infantry battalions rotated through different sectors, each battalion responsible for security in a specific area, conducting operations designed to find and engage Viet Cong forces and to protect the population from enemy intimidation and terrorism. A typical day for a company in the 199th during Operation Fairfax might start before dawn, with a patrol leaving the company's base to sweep a specific area, searching for signs of enemy activity, checking villages for weapons or supplies, talking to civilians to gather intelligence. The patrol might last several hours, moving through rice paddies and along canals, always alert for ambushes or booby traps. If they encountered enemy forces, a firefight would develop, usually brief and violent, the Viet Cong engaging and then breaking contact before American firepower could be brought to bear. During the day, the company might conduct a cordon and search operation, surrounding a village and systematically searching every structure. These operations were supposed to be conducted with Vietnamese National Police who would question villagers and identify suspected Viet Cong, but the police weren't always available or willing to participate. The searches would find some contraband, some rice that was being stockpiled beyond what the villagers needed for themselves, and that was therefore probably intended for the Viet Cong, maybe some medical supplies or ammunition, occasionally weapons. At night, the company would send out ambush teams, squads positioned along trails or canals that intelligence indicated the Viet Cong used for movement. The teams would move into position in darkness, set up in locations that provided good fields of fire, and wait. Sometimes nothing would happen. The teams would spend the entire night in position without seeing any enemy activity. Sometimes Viet Cong would move through the area, and the ambush would be triggered, a sudden explosion of gunfire, Americans engaging with automatic weapons and grenades, Viet Cong returning fire or trying to escape. These night ambushes were dangerous for everyone involved, confusion and darkness, and the risk of friendly fire, but they were one of the few ways to catch the Viet Cong, who moved primarily at night. The 199th also conducted larger operations during Operation Fairfax, battalion-size or even brigade-size operations, designed to sweep entire areas and to destroy enemy base camps and supply caches. These operations involved extensive planning and coordination, artillery and air support, helicopter insertions to position forces quickly. The goal was to find the 165A Regiment's main force units, the battalions that conducted larger attacks rather than just guerrilla operations, and to destroy them in conventional battles where American firepower would be decisive. One of the most significant engagements during Operation Fairfax occurred on December 6, 1967, 5 miles north of the village of Tan Nguyen, when elements from Company A, 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry, located a battalion-sized Viet Cong base camp 35 miles northeast of Saigon. The discovery was accidental, the company conducting a routine patrol when they stumbled onto a complex of bunkers and fortified positions. Signs that a major enemy force was operating in the area. The initial contact was fierce and immediate. The Viet Cong defending the base camp opened fire on Company A with automatic weapons and RPGs, catching the Americans in a kill zone that had been prepared specifically for situations like this. Company A suffered heavy casualties in the first minutes of the engagement, soldiers killed or wounded before they could find cover. The company threatened with being overrun by superior enemy forces. But Company A held, returned fire, called for support. 2 platoons from the company, reinforced by elements of 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry and Troop D, 17th Cavalry, launched a counterattack that turned the tide of the battle. Artillery fire was called in on the base camp, shells pounding the bunkers and fighting positions. Helicopter gunships arrived and added their firepower. Slowly, with heavy casualties on both sides, the Americans drove the Viet Cong out of the base camp. When the fighting ended, and when the Americans could search the area, they counted 67 Viet Cong dead, enemy bodies left behind in the retreat. The base camp was destroyed, bunkers blown up with explosives, supplies captured or destroyed. It was a tactical victory, the kind of engagement that looked good in after-action reports and that suggested Operation Fairfax was succeeding in degrading enemy capability. This battle also produced one of Operation Fairfax's most notable heroes, Chaplain Captain Angelo J. Liddicky, a Catholic priest serving as a chaplain with the 199th, was with the units engaged in the fighting at Tan Nguyen. When the casualties started mounting, when wounded soldiers needed help and medical evacuation, Liddicky moved through heavy enemy fire to reach the wounded. He carried over 20 men to safety, moving repeatedly through areas where machine gun fire and grenades were landing, exposing himself to enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to positions where they could receive medical treatment. Liddicky was wounded himself, hit in the neck and foot by shrapnel, but he continued working, continued carrying wounded soldiers, continued administering last rites to dying men. His actions that day saved lives, gave wounded soldiers chances they wouldn't have had if he hadn't been willing to risk his own life to help them. For his extraordinary heroism, Liddicky was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only chaplain to receive the decoration during the Vietnam War, and one of only a handful of chaplains in American military history to be so honored. But for all the patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations, for all the Viet Cong killed and captured, for all the base camps destroyed and supplies captured, Operation Fairfax wasn't achieving its fundamental objective. Security in Gia Dinh Province was improving in some measurable ways. The number of terrorist incidents in some areas decreased. Roads that had been cut repeatedly by the Viet Cong were kept open more consistently. Government officials felt somewhat safer, less worried about assassination. But the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political organization that allowed the 165A Regiment to continue operating, remained largely intact. The intelligence operations that were supposed to identify and eliminate the political cadre, the shadow government that the Viet Cong maintained in the villages, weren't succeeding. Informants were rare because people were afraid of Viet Cong retaliation. The police and ARVN didn't have the capability or sometimes the will to conduct the kind of detailed investigations necessary to root out the infrastructure. The pacification side of Operation Fairfax, the part that was supposed to win popular support for the government by providing services and protection and economic development, was failing even more dramatically than the military side. The South Vietnamese government wasn't delivering on promises of reform, wasn't providing the services that would make people believe the government was worth supporting. Corruption continued to plague the administration. Officials appointed to positions in Gia Dinh Province were often incompetent or corrupt or both. The people saw little reason to trust the government or to cooperate with security forces. Operation Fairfax officially concluded on December 15, 1967. In the 13 months it had been conducted, American and South Vietnamese forces claimed to have killed or captured over 1,200 Viet Cong. The 199th Infantry Brigade had conducted thousands of patrols, hundreds of ambushes, dozens of major operations. Security in Gia Dinh Province had improved in some measurable ways. The operation had cost American lives, soldiers killed in ambushes and firefights and by booby traps and mines. But the losses were considered acceptable given the strategic importance of protecting Saigon. General Westmoreland regarded Operation Fairfax as a limited success. The operation had achieved some of its objectives, had improved security around Saigon to some degree, had killed and captured significant numbers of Viet Cong. But Westmoreland also recognized that the operation had revealed serious problems with American strategy in Vietnam, problems that went beyond the specific situation in Gia Dinh Province. The most significant conclusion Westmoreland drew from Operation Fairfax was that the integration of American and ARVN units was counterproductive, that pairing American and South Vietnamese battalions and having them work together reduced the ARVN to combat auxiliaries rather than building their capability to operate independently. The South Vietnamese military needed to learn to conduct operations on their own, needed to take full responsibility for security rather than relying on Americans to do the heavy lifting while they followed along. This conclusion would influence American strategy going forward, would lead to greater emphasis on what became known as Vietnamization, the process of building up South Vietnamese forces so they could take over full responsibility for the war and allow American forces to withdraw. But Operation Fairfax had demonstrated how difficult that process would be, how long it would take to build an effective South Vietnamese military when corruption and poor leadership and lack of popular support plagued the entire system. On December 15th, as Operation Fairfax officially ended, American forces turned over responsibility for the defense of Saigon to the ARVN. This transfer was presented as a sign of confidence in the South Vietnamese military, evidence that the ARVN was now capable of defending the capital without direct American military involvement in security operations. U.S. forces would remain responsible for defending themselves and their facilities in Saigon, but the broader security mission would now belong to the South Vietnamese. This transfer of responsibility was made with considerable ceremony and optimistic statements from both American and South Vietnamese officials. The operation had been successful. Security around Saigon had improved. The ARVN was ready to take over. The 199th Infantry Brigade would redeploy to other areas, would conduct different operations, would go back to the search and destroy missions that most American units in Vietnam were conducting. And then, 6 weeks later, everything Operation Fairfax had supposedly accomplished was shown to be an illusion. The Tet Offensive began on January 31st, 1968, 6 weeks after Operation Fairfax officially ended. It was the largest coordinated communist military operation of the entire Vietnam War. Simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam, assaults designed to spark a general uprising against the South Vietnamese government, and to demonstrate that the Viet Cong could strike anywhere despite years of American military operations. In Saigon and the surrounding areas of Gia Dinh Province, the attacks were devastating. Viet Cong forces, including elements of the 165A Capital Liberation Regiment, that Operation Fairfax had supposedly neutralized, attacked military bases, government buildings, the presidential palace, even the American embassy. These forces had infiltrated the city in the days and weeks before Tet, had moved weapons into position, had prepared for attacks that caught American and South Vietnamese forces almost completely by surprise. The most dramatic attack, the one that received the most media attention and that had the greatest psychological impact, was the assault on the American embassy. A 19-man Viet Cong sapper team from the C-10 Sapper Battalion attacked the embassy in the early morning hours of January 31st, penetrating the compound and attempting to seize the Chancery building. While the attack was ultimately repulsed, while none of the sappers survived or succeeded in entering the Chancery, the images of Viet Cong, forces fighting inside the American embassy compound, were broadcast around the world. Those images had a profound impact on American public opinion. The United States had been fighting in Vietnam for over 2.5 years. 20,000 Americans had been killed. Nearly 500,000 American troops were deployed to Vietnam. And despite all that sacrifice and effort, the Viet Cong had managed to attack the American embassy in the heart of Saigon. General Westmoreland had been saying for months that the war was being won, that progress was being made, that the enemy was weakening. The Tet Offensive made those claims look like either lies or delusions. For Operation Fairfax, Tet was a complete failure, a demonstration that 13 months of operations around Saigon had not seriously disrupted the Viet Cong's capability to threaten the capital. The forces that attacked during Tet had been operating in Gia Dinh Province during the entire period of Operation Fairfax. They'd been infiltrating weapons into Saigon, while American and ARVN forces were conducting patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations. They had been preparing for the offensive while Operation Fairfax was supposedly improving security and extending government control. The fact that the Viet Cong could launch such attacks just 6 weeks after Operation Fairfax ended raised obvious questions. Had the operation accomplished anything at all? Had the 1,200 Viet Cong killed or captured made any difference? Had the security improvements been real, or had they been illusions? Temporary effects that disappeared as soon as American forces redeployed elsewhere. The infrastructure that Operation Fairfax had failed to destroy had allowed the Viet Cong to continue operating, had allowed them to gather the intelligence necessary to plan the Tet attacks, had allowed them to infiltrate forces into Saigon, had allowed them to execute a complex coordinated offensive that demonstrated the government's continued inability to protect even its own capital. The 199th Infantry Brigade, which had spent 13 months conducting Operation Fairfax, found itself fighting desperately during Tet to defend American installations around Saigon. The brigade was conducting Operation Uniontown in Dong Nai Province when Tet began, and it immediately had to shift to defending 2 field force headquarters at Long Bin Post against attacks by the Viet Cong 275th Regiment. 1 battalion was moved by helicopter to attack a Viet Cong command post at the Pu Tho racetrack inside Saigon, then engaged in house-to-house fighting in Cho Lon, the Chinese district of Saigon, where Viet Cong forces had established strong positions. The fighting during Tet was fierce and costly. The 199th inflicted heavy casualties on Viet Cong forces, killed hundreds of enemy fighters in the battles around Long Bin and in Saigon proper. But the brigade also took casualties, soldiers killed and wounded in urban combat that was more intense than anything they'd experienced during Operation Fairfax. The Tet Offensive was eventually defeated. Viet Cong forces were driven out of the cities they had briefly occupied. Government control was restored, but the cost was high and the psychological impact was profound. Looking back at Operation Fairfax from the perspective of decades later, with access to information and analyses that weren't available at the time, we can see what the operation revealed about the war in Vietnam and about American strategy. These revelations weren't what anyone involved in planning or conducting Operation Fairfax had hoped for, but they were important nonetheless. First, Operation Fairfax revealed that counterinsurgency and pacification were much more difficult than American military planners had understood. The strategy of finding and fixing and destroying enemy forces, the strategy that worked in conventional warfare, didn't work against an enemy that could blend into the population, and that had political infrastructure among the people. You could kill 1,200 Viet Cong fighters and capture their weapons and destroy their base camps. And 6 weeks later, they'd be launching major attacks on the capital because the infrastructure that allowed them to recruit and organize and operate hadn't been destroyed. Second, the operation revealed that the South Vietnamese military had fundamental problems that couldn't be fixed quickly or easily. The ARVN wasn't just poorly trained or poorly equipped, problems that could be solved with better training programs and more American-supplied weapons. The ARVN had problems with leadership and motivation and corruption that went to the core of what the South Vietnamese military was and how it operated. Building an effective South Vietnamese military would require addressing these deeper problems, would require political and social changes that the South Vietnamese government was unwilling or unable to make. Third, Operation Fairfax revealed that the population in contested areas like Gia Dinh Province wasn't going to support the government just because American and South Vietnamese military forces provided security. The people needed reasons to believe the government was worth supporting, needed to see that supporting the government would improve their lives and the lives of their children. The South Vietnamese government wasn't providing those reasons, wasn't delivering the services and reforms that would win popular support. Fourth, the operation revealed that American military operations in Vietnam were focused on the wrong metrics. Success was being measured in body counts, in numbers of enemy killed or captured, in weapons seized and base camps destroyed. These metrics looked impressive in reports back to Washington, suggested that progress was being made, that the war was being won. But these metrics didn't measure what actually mattered, which was whether government control was being extended, whether the population was supporting the government, whether the enemy's ability to continue the war was being degraded in ways that would lead to eventual victory. Fifth, Operation Fairfax revealed that American strategy in Vietnam was based on flawed assumptions about the nature of the war. The assumption that attrition would work, that killing enemy forces faster than they could be replaced would lead to victory, was wrong when the enemy could recruit new fighters from the population and could regenerate units that had been destroyed in battle. The assumption that American firepower and mobility would be decisive advantages was wrong when the enemy chose not to fight conventional battles where those advantages mattered. Sixth, the operation revealed the limits of what American military power could accomplish in Vietnam. The United States could deploy 500,000 troops, could conduct thousands of operations, could kill tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, could drop more bombs than had been dropped in all of World War II. But none of that would matter if the underlying political situation wasn't being addressed. If the South Vietnamese government remained corrupt and ineffective, if the population didn't support the war effort. Behind all the strategic analyses and the lessons learned and the historical significance, Operation Fairfax had a human cost that needs to be acknowledged. American soldiers died in Gia Dinh Province conducting patrols and ambushes and cordon and search. Operations, young men who were killed by enemy fire or by booby traps or by mines. Soldiers whose names are inscribed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. The exact casualty figures for Operation Fairfax aren't clearly documented in most sources, partly because the operation lasted over a year, and partly because it was one operation among many being conducted simultaneously throughout Vietnam. But we know that the 199th Infantry Brigade, the primary American unit involved in the operation, suffered significant casualties during its time conducting Operation Fairfax and during the Tet Offensive that followed. We know about soldiers like those from Company A, 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry, who were caught in that ambush in Thu Duc District in January 67, the first month the 199th was involved in the operation. We know about the soldiers killed in the battle at Tan Nguyen in December 67 when they stumbled onto that Viet Cong base camp. We know about Chaplain Lidicki, who was wounded while saving other wounded soldiers. We know about the soldiers from the 199th who were killed during the Tet Offensive fighting in Cholon and at Long Binh. Each of those soldiers had a story, had family and friends back home, had hopes and dreams and plans for the future. They died fighting in a war that most Americans came to question, fighting in an operation that ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, fighting for a South Vietnamese government that collapsed 7 years after American forces withdrew. South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians also paid a price during Operation Fairfax. ARVN soldiers were killed in the same ambushes and firefights that killed Americans. Vietnamese civilians were caught in the crossfire between government forces and the Viet Cong, were killed by artillery fire and airstrikes and by Viet Cong terrorism. Villages were damaged or destroyed in operations. Families were displaced. lives were disrupted in ways that would affect people for decades after the war ended. The Viet Cong forces that Operation Fairfax engaged also suffered casualties, over 1,200 killed or captured according to American claims. Those fighters also had families, had reasons for fighting, had beliefs about what they were fighting for. Some of them were committed communists who genuinely believed in the cause of reunifying Vietnam under Hanoi's control. Some were fighting because they opposed the South Vietnamese government and saw the Viet Cong as the lesser of two evils. Some were fighting because they'd been conscripted, or because their villages supported the Viet Cong and they had no real choice. Operation Fairfax ended over 55 years ago, but its legacy and the lessons it provides remain relevant for understanding not just the Vietnam War, but also for understanding counterinsurgency and pacification operations more broadly. The operation was one of many conducted during the war, not as famous as big. Battles like Ia Drang or Khe San or Hamburger Hill, but in some ways more important because it tested American strategy at its core. The fundamental lesson of Operation Fairfax is that military operations alone cannot win a counterinsurgency campaign when the underlying political situation doesn't support military success. You can conduct all the patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations you want. You can kill thousands of enemy fighters, but if the political infrastructure that supports those fighters remains intact, if the government can't or won't provide services and reforms that win popular support, if corruption and inefficiency plague the administration, then the military operations are just treating symptoms rather than addressing causes. Another lesson is that building indigenous military forces to take over security responsibilities is extremely difficult and time-consuming when those forces have fundamental problems with leadership and motivation. The ARVN, in 1967, wasn't ready to take over security for Gia Dinh Province despite 13 months of working alongside American forces, despite training and advice and equipment. The same problems that plagued the ARVN in '67 would plague them throughout the war, would ultimately contribute to the collapse of South Vietnam in 1975 when North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive. A third lesson is that metrics matter, that measuring success by body counts and weapons captured and base camps destroyed can be misleading when those metrics don't actually measure progress towards strategic objectives. Operation Fairfax looked successful by those metrics, looked like it was accomplishing its mission. But when tested by the Tet Offensive, when the Viet Cong demonstrated that they could still threaten Saigon despite 13 months of operations, the real results of Operation Fairfax became clear. A fourth lesson is about the importance of understanding the enemy and the nature of the war being fought. The Viet Cong in Gia Dinh Province weren't defeated by Operation Fairfax, weren't prevented from conducting the Tet Offensive, because the operation focused on destroying their military capability while failing to seriously disrupt their political infrastructure. Understanding that the Viet Cong were as much a political organization as a military force would have required different operations, different tactics, different measures of success. These lessons weren't learned quickly or easily. The same mistakes that characterized Operation Fairfax would be repeated in other operations throughout the Vietnam War. The same flawed assumptions about how to fight counterinsurgency campaigns. The same focus on military operations while political and social factors were neglected. It wasn't until much later, after the war had been lost, that the full lessons of operations like Fairfax were understood and incorporated into military doctrine. The 199th Infantry Brigade that conducted Operation Fairfax went on to fight throughout the remainder of its deployment to Vietnam. The brigade participated in the defense against the Tet Offensive, conducted operations in War Zone D and other areas, returned to the United States in October 1970, having earned a Valorous Unit Award and a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. The soldiers who served with the 199th during Operation Fairfax carried the memories of that experience for the rest of their lives, the patrols through rice paddies and along canals, the ambushes at night, the cordon and search operations in villages, the constant threat of enemy attack. To really understand what Operation Fairfax meant for the soldiers who fought in it, we need to look at the tactical reality of how operations were actually conducted on the ground, how patrols worked, how ambushes were set up, how cordon and search operations were executed, The strategic overview tells one story, but the tactical details tell another. The story of young soldiers trying to find an enemy who didn't want to be found, and who had every advantage of terrain and local knowledge. A typical patrol during Operation Fairfax would involve a reinforced platoon, maybe 30 or 40 soldiers, moving through the operational area on foot. The platoon would leave their base before dawn, moving out in darkness to reach their patrol area before the Viet Cong could observe them and avoid contact. The point man would lead, eyes scanning the trail or rice paddy dike ahead for signs of booby traps or ambushes. Every step potentially the last if there was a mine buried in the path, or a pressure release trigger connected to explosives. Behind the point man came the rest of the patrol, soldiers spread out in tactical formation, maintaining intervals so that a single mine or ambush wouldn't hit everyone at once. They carried M16 rifles, some had M79 grenade launchers, the machine gunner humped an M60. Everyone carried ammunition and grenades and water and whatever else they needed for a patrol that might last 8 or 10 hours in heat and humidity that reached oppressive levels by mid-morning. The terrain varied depending on which district they were patrolling. In some areas it was rice paddies, flat expanses of water and mud and rice plants, dikes separating one paddy from another, no cover except the occasional tree line. In other areas it was villages, clusters of hooches with thatched roofs, narrow paths between structures, gardens, and animal pens. Civilians who watched the Americans with expressions that could mean anything or nothing. In still other areas it was canals and streams bordered by dense vegetation, triple canopy jungle in some places where visibility was measured in meters. The patrol would move to a specific area that intelligence suggested might have enemy activity. Maybe there had been reports of Viet Cong movement the night before. Maybe. Informants had provided information about a meeting. Maybe a previous patrol had found signs that someone was using a particular trail. The platoon would sweep the area, searching for enemy forces, searching for caches of weapons or supplies, searching for anything that would indicate Viet Cong presence. Most patrols made no contact with the enemy. The Viet Cong had their own intelligence networks, knew when American forces were operating in an area, could avoid contact when they chose to. They'd observe from hiding positions, watching the Americans move through the area, noting patrol patterns and timings and routes, information they'd use for planning ambushes. The Americans would patrol for hours, finding nothing, seeing civilians who claimed to know nothing about Viet Cong activities, returning to base frustrated and exhausted. But sometimes the patrols made contact, and when they did, the violence was sudden and overwhelming. The Viet Cong would spring an ambush from prepared. Positions would hit the patrol with automatic weapons fire and RPGs, would try to inflict maximum casualties in the first seconds before the Americans could react. The patrol would hit the ground, would return fire, would call for artillery support and helicopter gunships, would try to maneuver to flank the enemy positions. The firefight might last 10 minutes or an hour, depending on how determined the Viet Cong were to hold their positions and how quickly American reinforcements and supporting fire could arrive. The cordon and search operations that were a major component of Operation Fairfax required more planning and more forces than patrols. A typical cordon and search would involve at least a company, sometimes a battalion, establishing a perimeter around a village that intelligence indicated was harboring Viet Cong or storing supplies. The operation would begin before dawn, units moving into position under cover of darkness, establishing the cordon before the village woke up, so that no one could escape before the search began. Once the cordon was in place, search teams would enter the village systematically, moving from structure to structure, searching every building, every bunker, every storage area. The searches were supposed to be conducted with Vietnamese National Police, or ARVN soldiers, who could question villagers in Vietnamese and who could identify suspicious individuals or activities. But the police and ARVN weren't always available or willing to participate. And many searches were conducted by American soldiers who couldn't communicate effectively with the villagers and who had to rely on interpreters who were often of questionable reliability. The searches would turn up some contraband, rice stored in quantities beyond what the villagers needed for themselves, suggesting it was being stockpiled for the Viet Cong, medical supplies that had no legitimate use in a rural village, ammunition hidden in bunkers or buried in gardens. Occasionally, weapons, though the Viet Cong were usually careful not to leave weapons where they could be found in searches. documents that might provide intelligence about enemy organization or plans. But the searches were also frustrating, because the Viet Cong who lived in or operated from the villages could usually blend in with the civilian population, could hide their weapons before the cordon was established, could avoid being identified even when questioned. Without good intelligence about who specifically was Viet Cong and who was just a farmer trying to survive, it was nearly impossible to identify enemy personnel in a village population. The night ambushes were perhaps the most dangerous operations conducted during Operation Fairfax. Small teams of soldiers positioned along trails or canals that intelligence indicated the Viet Cong used for movement, waiting in darkness for hours for enemy forces that might or might not appear. An ambush team might consist of a squad, 8 to 10 men, carrying automatic weapons and claymore mines and grenades, moving into position after dark and establishing a kill zone along a likely route of approach. The team would move into position slowly and carefully, using whatever concealment the terrain provided, setting up in locations that gave good fields of fire while minimizing their own visibility. They'd position claymore mines along the trail or canal, angled to direct the blast into the kill zone, connected by wire to the detonators that the team leader controlled. They'd set up their weapons, machine guns covering the main approach, rifles covering flanks and alternate routes, everyone in position and ready, and then they'd wait. Hours of waiting in darkness, every sound, potentially enemy movement, or just an animal or the wind in vegetation. The tension was constant and exhausting, knowing that at any moment Viet Cong could appear and the ambush would be triggered, knowing that the first indication of enemy presence might be the sound of movement just meters away, knowing that mistakes or bad luck could mean dying in darkness far from help. When an ambush was triggered, when the enemy walked into the kill zone, and the claymores detonated and the machine guns opened fire, the violence was intense and brief. The Viet Cong who survived the initial fusillade would return fire or would try to escape, some running forward through the kill zone, some trying to withdraw the way they'd come, all of them trying to survive. The ambush team would continue firing until the enemy was destroyed or had escaped, then would call for extraction, would get out of the area before other Viet Cong forces could respond to the contact. One aspect of Operation Fairfax that deserves special attention is the intelligence war that was fought alongside and in support of the military operations. The effort to identify Viet Cong personnel and infrastructure, to locate enemy bases and supply caches, to predict where enemy attacks might occur, and to prevent them. This intelligence war was in many ways more important than the military operations themselves, because without good intelligence, the military operations were just moving blindly through the operational area, hoping to encounter the enemy. The intelligence picture in Gia Dinh Province when Operation Fairfax began was incomplete and often inaccurate. American and South Vietnamese intelligence agencies knew that the 165A Regiment was operating in the area, knew roughly where its battalions were positioned, knew some of the locations where they established temporary base camps, but they didn't have detailed intelligence about the regiment's political infrastructure, about the network of secret operatives who lived among the civilian population, and who provided the intelligence and logistics support that allowed military operations to continue. The challenge was that the Viet Cong political infrastructure was specifically designed to be invisible, to operate without being detected. The people who were part of this infrastructure looked like ordinary civilians, had regular jobs, or appeared to be farmers or shopkeepers, moved through society without attracting attention. They communicated through dead drops and coded messages, met in locations that appeared innocent, maintained operational security that made penetrating their organization extraordinarily difficult. There were several approaches to gathering intelligence that were used during Operation Fairfax, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The most valuable intelligence came from informants, people who had knowledge of Viet Cong activities, and who were willing to provide that information to American or South Vietnamese forces. These informants might be Viet Cong defectors, Hoi Chan, who'd switch sides and who could provide detailed information about enemy organization and operations. They might be villagers who'd become disillusioned with the Viet Cong or who'd been mistreated by them. They might be people motivated by money, by revenge, by fear of what would happen to them if they didn't cooperate. But informants were rare in Gia Dinh Province during Operation Fairfax, much rarer than intelligence officers would have liked. The Viet Cong had an effective system of maintaining control over the population through a combination of propaganda and intimidation and selective terrorism. People who were suspected of informing for the government were killed, not quietly, but publicly and brutally, as examples to others of what happened to those who cooperated with the enemy. This created a climate of fear that made people reluctant to provide information even when they knew something that might be useful. Another source of intelligence was captured documents. Papers found during searches of villages or base camps or on bodies of dead Viet Cong fighters. These documents might include orders from higher headquarters, reports on operations, rosters of personnel, maps showing locations of bases or supply caches. The challenge was that most Americans couldn't read Vietnamese, and the translation process was slow, so captured documents often weren't exploited quickly enough to be tactically useful. Prisoner interrogations provided another source of intelligence, though the quality varied significantly depending on the prisoner's knowledge and willingness to talk. Most captured Viet Cong were low-ranking fighters who didn't know much about the larger organization or about operations beyond their immediate area. They might know where their unit had been operating, where their base camp was located, who their commanders were, but they often didn't know anything about other units or about planned operations. And many prisoners were reluctant to talk, either because they were committed to the cause or because they feared retaliation against their families if they provided information. Signals intelligence, the interception and analysis of enemy radio communications, provided some useful intelligence during Operation Fairfax, though the Viet Cong were careful about radio use and often communicated through couriers rather than transmitting messages that could be intercepted. When radio communications were intercepted, they were usually encoded or used code words that required time to decrypt or interpret, again limiting their tactical usefulness. Aerial reconnaissance, both from aircraft and from helicopters, provided intelligence about enemy movement and about locations of base camps and trails. Pilots and observers could spot signs of recent activity, paths through vegetation that indicated movement, fighting positions that had been prepared, areas where supplies might be cached. But aerial reconnaissance had limitations in terrain, like Gia Dinh Province, where dense vegetation concealed much of what was happening on the ground. The most frustrating aspect of the intelligence war during Operation Fairfax was that even when good intelligence was available, even when sources provided accurate information about Viet Cong, locations or plans, the enemy's mobility and their ability to blend into the population meant that by the time operations were mounted based on that intelligence, the enemy had often moved or dispersed. The Viet Cong had their own intelligence networks and knew when American forces were preparing operations, knew when patrols were scheduled, could avoid areas where they'd be at risk. The National Police were supposed to be the primary agency for gathering intelligence on the Viet Cong political infrastructure, for identifying who in the villages were secret operatives, and for eliminating them through arrest or through other means. But the police in Gia Dinh Province were poorly trained and poorly equipped for this mission, were often corrupt and focused more on extorting money from civilians than on conducting serious intelligence operations. The police chief for the area, who was supposed to coordinate with American forces during Operation Fairfax, was more interested in political maneuvering than in fighting the Viet Cong. One of the most challenging aspects of operations in Gia Dinh Province during Operation Fairfax was dealing with the tunnel complexes that the Viet Cong had constructed over years of effort. Underground networks that provided hiding places and supply storage and command facilities that were extremely difficult to detect and destroy. These tunnel complexes had been built during the war against the French in the 1950s and had been expanded and improved continuously, some of them extending for miles underground with multiple levels and elaborate concealment. The most famous tunnel complex in the area was at Cu Chi on the western edge of Gia Dinh Province, where the Viet Cong had constructed an underground city that included living quarters, hospitals, workshops, storage areas, and command facilities. The Cu Chi tunnels had been discovered during Operation Crimp in January of '66, when Australian troops found tunnel entrances during a search of the area. The discovery revealed the extent and sophistication of Viet Cong underground construction, demonstrated that the enemy had capabilities that American commanders hadn't fully appreciated. During Operation Fairfax, American units encountered numerous tunnel complexes in the districts around Saigon, smaller than Cu Chi but still significant. The tunnels would be discovered during searches of villages or base camps, entrances concealed by vegetation, or by removable camouflage, often only noticed when soldiers literally stepped on them, or when someone noticed that the ground sounded hollow. Once a tunnel entrance was discovered, the challenge became determining what was down there and clearing it of enemy personnel and supplies. The standard procedure for dealing with tunnels was to call in soldiers specially trained for tunnel operations, soldiers who became known as tunnel rats. These were usually smaller men who could fit through the narrow tunnel entrances and passages, soldiers who volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in Vietnam, going underground where the enemy might be waiting in ambush, where booby traps could kill without warning, where the darkness and confined spaces created psychological stress that few people could handle. A tunnel rat would enter a tunnel, armed with a pistol and a flashlight, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with nothing but his hands because the confined spaces made it impossible to maneuver with rifles or other weapons. He'd crawl through the tunnel, checking for booby traps, checking for enemy personnel, trying to determine the extent of the tunnel system and what it contained. If he encountered Viet Cong in the tunnel, a firefight would occur in pitch darkness in spaces so confined that there was no room to maneuver, combat that was as close and personal as war ever gets. The tunnel. Rats of the 199th Infantry Brigade, who operated during Operation Fairfax, found extensive tunnel systems in multiple locations, systems that revealed how the Viet Cong had been able to operate so effectively around Saigon, despite American and South Vietnamese military presence. The tunnels allowed enemy forces to hide during American operations, to store supplies that couldn't be found in surface searches, to move through the operational area without being observed, to survive artillery fire and airstrikes by going underground. Clearing tunnel complexes was time-consuming and dangerous. Even after a tunnel rat had explored a tunnel system and determined that it was unoccupied, destroying the tunnels was difficult. Explosives could be used to collapse tunnel sections, but the tunnels were often deep enough that surface explosions didn't do much damage. Bulldozers could be brought in to excavate the tunnels, but that was practical only in areas where bulldozers could operate. Chemical. Weapons, specifically riot control agents, could be pumped into the tunnels to drive out anyone hiding inside or to make the tunnels uninhabitable, though the effectiveness of this approach was limited because the tunnel systems often had multiple entrances and the gas would dissipate. The existence of these tunnel complexes was one reason why Operation Fairfax couldn't eliminate the Viet Cong threat in Gia Dinh Province. The 165A Regiment could disperse when American operations were underway, could hide in tunnels, could avoid contact when they chose to. Even when surface base camps were destroyed and supplies were captured, the underground infrastructure remained and could be used to re-establish operations once American forces moved to other areas. Understanding Operation Fairfax requires understanding the weapons and equipment that both sides used, because the tactical realities of the operation were shaped by what soldiers and fighters carried and how effectively they could use. The Americans had significant advantages in firepower and technology, but the Viet Cong had advantages in mobility and in knowledge of terrain, and the weapons each side used reflected these different approaches to warfare. The standard American infantry weapon during Operation Fairfax was the M16 rifle, a lightweight assault rifle that fired a small caliber high-velocity round, the 5.56 millimeter cartridge. The M16 was controversial in '66 and '67. Early production models had reliability problems that caused jams in combat, problems that were eventually fixed, but that cost American lives before the solutions were implemented. The rifle was accurate and had relatively low recoil, but it required careful maintenance in the dirt and humidity of Vietnam, and many soldiers initially didn't trust it. Soldiers in the 199th carried other weapons as well. Each squad had an M60 machine gun, a belt-fed weapon that fired the 7.62 millimeter round, the same ammunition used in the previous generation's M14 rifle. The M60 was heavy, over 23 pounds without ammunition, but it provided sustained fire capability that was essential in firefights. The machine gunner and his assistant gunner carried the weapon and ammunition, a burden that meant they couldn't carry as much of other supplies as riflemen did. The M79 grenade launcher, nicknamed the blooper because of the sound it made when fired, was another important weapon. It was a single-shot break-action weapon that fired a 40 millimeter grenade, essentially a small artillery round that could be delivered accurately out to about 150 meters. The M79 was effective against enemy positions in vegetation or in structures, could deliver high explosive or white phosphorus or smoke grenades depending on what the situation required. Some soldiers carried M72 Law rockets, light anti-tank weapons, disposable rocket launchers that could be used against bunkers or fortified positions. The Law was a tube-launched rocket that packed significant explosive power, though it wasn't particularly accurate beyond 200 meters. Carrying Laws meant carrying additional weight, but they provided a capability that was sometimes essential when encountering enemy positions that couldn't be destroyed with small arms fire. The Viet Cong forces that the 199th faced during Operation Fairfax were armed primarily with AK-47 assault rifles, Soviet or Chinese-manufactured weapons that were rugged and reliable, that fired a larger round than the M16, the 7.62 by 39 mm cartridge. The AK-47 was less accurate than the M16 at longer ranges, but was extremely reliable and continued functioning even when poorly maintained or when full of dirt and mud. Many American soldiers respected the AK-47. Some even preferred it to the M16, though carrying enemy weapons violated regulations. The Viet Cong also had machine guns, Soviet RPD, and Chinese Type 56 models that provided supporting fire in ambushes and defensive positions. They had rocket-propelled grenades, the RPG-2, and later the more effective RPG-7, shoulder-fired weapons that could destroy vehicles or fortified positions, that could kill or wound multiple soldiers with a single hit. They had mortars that could deliver indirect fire on American positions from concealed locations. They had recoilless rifles that could engage targets at longer ranges with devastating effect. What the Viet Cong didn't have was the supporting firepower that American forces could call on. The 199th Infantry Brigade operating during Operation Fairfax had access to artillery support from 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers positioned at fire bases throughout the operational area, could call for fire missions that would deliver dozens of high explosive rounds on target within minutes. They had helicopter gunships, UH-1 Hueys armed with rockets and machine guns that could arrive quickly when units were in contact and could deliver devastating fire on enemy positions. They had tactical air support, jet aircraft that could drop bombs or napalm or could strafe with cannons, though air support in Gia Dinh Province had to be used carefully because of the proximity to Saigon and the presence of civilians in the operational area. They had medical evacuation helicopters that could extract wounded soldiers and get them to hospitals within minutes, capabilities that saved lives and that the Viet Cong couldn't match. These advantages in supporting arms meant that when American forces could fix enemy forces in place, when they could prevent the Viet Cong from breaking contact and escaping, the resulting battles usually ended with heavy enemy casualties and relatively light American losses. But the challenge was fixing the enemy, preventing them from choosing when and where to fight, and from disengaging when American firepower became overwhelming. The Viet Cong were masters at engaging briefly and then disappearing, at inflicting casualties and then breaking contact before American supporting arms could be brought to bear. Combat operations during Operation Fairfax took a psychological toll on the soldiers of the 199th Infantry Brigade that was different from the toll taken by large conventional battles, a toll that came from the constant low-level stress of operations where the enemy could be anywhere, where any step might trigger a mine, where any patrol might be ambushed, where death could come without warning from an enemy you couldn't see. The soldiers who conducted patrols day after day, who set ambushes night after night, who searched villages and encountered hostile or sullen civilians who might or might not be Viet Cong, developed a kind of paranoia that was both necessary for survival and psychologically exhausting. You had to assume that anyone might be the enemy, that any location might be dangerous, that any sound or movement might be the prelude to an attack. This constant vigilance, this inability to relax even when resting at base because the base might be mortared or attacked by sappers, wore soldiers down. The nature of counterinsurgency operations in Gia Dinh Province meant that soldiers couldn't identify clear progress toward victory. In a conventional war, you take territory and hold it. You push the enemy back, you see on maps that you're winning. But in Operation Fairfax, the same areas that were patrolled today would need to be patrolled tomorrow and the day after. The same villages that were searched this week would need to be searched again next week. The same roads that were secured today would be threatened again tomorrow. There was no front line that moved forward, no clear indication that all the patrolling and ambushing and searching was accomplishing anything permanent. This lack of visible progress created frustration and cynicism among soldiers. They'd conduct an operation, kill or capture some Viet Cong, destroy a base camp, feel like they'd accomplish something, and then a week later, they'd be back in the same area conducting the same kind of operation, because the enemy was active there again. They'd search a village, find contraband, detain suspects, and then be told that the suspects had been released because there wasn't enough evidence to hold them, or because someone had paid a bribe to get them freed. The relationship with Vietnamese civilians complicated the psychological reality of Operation Fairfax. The soldiers were supposed to be protecting these civilians, winning hearts and minds, demonstrating that the American and South Vietnamese governments could provide security and services. But many civilians were hostile, or at least uncooperative, some because they supported the Viet Cong, some because they'd been caught between the two sides for years and had learned that cooperating with either side could get you killed by the other. Soldiers would enter a village to conduct a search, be met with sullen stares, and non-cooperation, find that people claimed to know nothing about Viet Cong activity, even when there was clear evidence that enemy forces had been operating from the village. The frustration of trying to protect people who didn't seem to want to be protected, who might be hiding the enemy or providing them with supplies and intelligence, created anger and sometimes led to soldiers treating all Vietnamese civilians as potential enemies. The booby traps and mines that the Viet Cong used extensively in Gia Dinh Province added another layer of psychological stress. These weren't weapons that you could see and react to, weren't enemies you could fight. They were hidden in trails, buried in rice paddies, placed in ways that ordinary movement would trigger them. A soldier could walk a trail safely 100 times, and then on the 101st time step on a mine and be killed, or lose a leg, or be blinded. The randomness of it, the fact that luck played as large a role as skill or vigilance, made booby traps particularly demoralizing. Some soldiers in the 199th developed superstitions, rituals they believed would keep them safe. They'd carry lucky charms, wouldn't shave on patrol days, insisted on walking in specific positions in the patrol formation. These superstitions gave some illusion of control over situations that were fundamentally beyond anyone's control, and while commanders often tolerated them, as long as they didn't interfere with operations, they were symptoms of the psychological stress that constant danger created. Operation Fairfax was supposed to protect Saigon, was supposed to improve security in the districts around the capital, was supposed to reduce the Viet Cong threat and extend government control. For 13 months, from November 66 to December 67, American and South Vietnamese forces conducted thousands of operations designed to accomplish those objectives. They killed or captured over 1,200 Viet Cong fighters. They destroyed base camps and captured weapons and supplies. They conducted patrols and ambushes and cordon and search operations. They discovered and cleared tunnel complexes. They set up checkpoints and established bases. They suffered casualties and they inflicted casualties. The soldiers of the 199th Infantry Brigade, who conducted most of the American operations during Operation Fairfax, did their jobs professionally and courageously. Conducted operations in difficult terrain against an elusive enemy, took risks every day to accomplish their mission. They deserved better than what they got, which was a year of operations that appeared successful, but that ultimately failed to achieve the strategic objective of securing the approaches to Saigon and preventing the enemy from threatening the capital. And when Operation Fairfax officially ended on December 15, 67, when responsibility for security around Saigon was transferred from American forces to the ARVN. The operation was presented as a success, as evidence that the South Vietnamese military was now capable of defending its own capital. General Westmoreland believed that security in Gia Dinh Province had improved, that the Viet Cong threat had been reduced, that the ARVN could now handle the mission without direct American support. 6 weeks later, the Tet Offensive demonstrated that this assessment was catastrophically wrong, that the Viet Cong remained capable of threatening Saigon, despite everything Operation Fairfax had accomplished. The failure wasn't that American and South Vietnamese forces hadn't fought hard enough or hadn't conducted enough operations. The soldiers of the 199th conducted thousands of patrols, hundreds of ambushes, dozens of major operations. They were aggressive and professional. The failure was that the strategy underlying Operation Fairfax was flawed, was based on assumptions about how to fight counterinsurgency that didn't match the reality of the war being fought around Saigon. Killing Viet Cong fighters didn't matter when they could be replaced by new recruits from the population. Destroying base camps didn't matter when new base camps could be established in different locations. Conducting patrols didn't matter when the enemy chose when and where to fight, and could blend into the population when American forces were present. The Viet Cong political infrastructure in Gia Dinh Province, the network of secret operatives and supporters that allowed the 165A Regiment to continue operating, remained largely intact throughout Operation Fairfax and after its conclusion. The intelligence operations designed to identify and eliminate this infrastructure had limited success. The national police who were supposed to conduct these operations were ineffective. The South Vietnamese government that was supposed to win popular support through reforms and services failed to deliver. The result was that the military operations of Operation Fairfax treated symptoms without addressing causes, killed fighters without disrupting the organization that produced them. When Tet came 6 weeks after Operation Fairfax ended, the Viet Cong forces that attacked Saigon and the surrounding districts had been operating in Gia Dinh Province during the entire 13 months of the operation. They'd been infiltrating weapons into the city while American patrols were searching for them. They'd been preparing base camps and staging areas while American operations were supposedly clearing these areas. They had been gathering intelligence on American and South Vietnamese positions and routines while Operation Fairfax was supposedly disrupting their operations. The infrastructure that Operation Fairfax had failed to destroy had allowed all of this to happen. The Tet Offensive was eventually defeated. Viet Cong forces were driven out of Saigon and the other cities they had attacked. Government control was restored. The 199th Infantry Brigade fought with distinction during Tet, defended American installations, retook areas that the enemy had briefly occupied, inflicted heavy casualties on enemy forces. But the fact that Tet happened at all, that the Viet Cong could launch such attacks 6 weeks after Operation Fairfax had supposedly secured the approaches to Saigon, demonstrated that the operation had failed at its fundamental mission. Operation Fairfax revealed fundamental flaws in American strategy in Vietnam, revealed that the war couldn't be won, the way American military commanders were trying to win it, revealed that counterinsurgency required different approaches than conventional warfare. But the lessons weren't learned in time, weren't applied quickly enough or broadly enough to change the outcome of the war. The same mistakes would be repeated in other operations, the same flawed strategies would be pursued, until eventually American forces withdrew from Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese government collapsed. For the soldiers of the 199th Infantry Brigade who conducted Operation Fairfax, for the ARVN soldiers who worked alongside them, for the civilians caught between the two sides, for the Viet Cong fighters who opposed them, the operation was 13 months of combat and operations and patrols and ambushes, 13 months of casualties and small victories and frustrations, 13 months that in the end accomplished less than anyone hoped, and that ended in a demonstration of failure when the Tet Offensive began. The men who fought in Operation Fairfax, who conducted patrols through rice paddies and along canals, who set ambushes in darkness waiting for an enemy who might not come, who searched villages looking for weapons and Viet Cong, who called in artillery fire and helicopter gunships, who carried their wounded and their dead back to base, deserved to have their service remembered and honored, even though the operation they conducted ultimately failed. They did what they were ordered to do, fought the war they were sent to fight, followed the strategies their commanders developed. The failure of Operation Fairfax wasn't their failure. It was a failure of strategy, of understanding what kind of war Vietnam was and how it needed to be fought. This was Operation Fairfax, the 13-month battle for Saigon that killed over 1,200 Viet Cong, and that failed to prevent the Tet Offensive 6 weeks after it ended. The operation that revealed fundamental truths about the Vietnam War that American military and political leaders didn't want to acknowledge. The operation whose lessons should have been learned but weren't, contributing to a war that would continue for 7 more years before ending in defeat.